Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ICE Technical Meeting, International Development Advisor. This event is brought to you by the Institution of Civil Engineers. My name is Malvin Bennett. I am a student from Bina University, and it is a pleasure to act as your master ceremony in this event. Before we start, allow me to read the rundowns of our event this evening. First, I will be reading the rules of the webinar. After that, the event will be guided by the representative of ICE-JLA Localization, David May, as our moderator to start the presentation of our main speaker, Christopher Morris, and later will be followed by the supporting speaker, Larasati, Annisya, Putri. The event will then continue with a question and answer session. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for your own convenience, please pay attention to the following rules. For online attendees, you can ask your question to the speaker by pressing the raise hand feature, located at the bottom of the screen. For those who attend on site at Kemang, you can later raise your hand and the moderator will let you ask the question. The question should be in English. You can raise your question after the presentation of the speaker. Now, I would like to invite the representative of ICE-JLA Localization, David May, to give his opening remarks and also guide this webinar onwards. To David May, the time is yours.
Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everyone, ladies and gentlemen, to this double meeting that we're going to have. First of all, with a student from Venus, and secondly, from Chris Morris, who worked with me some time ago. I'm going to introduce Lara first, and then she'll give her talk, and then I'll give a longer introduction to Chris. Laura's talk, if I can see it properly, is analysis of pedestrian facilities level at the service-based, the class of railway station using PTV Visual. This is to try and make crossing the road safe in Jakarta. I think it's quite a challenge. Lara's also tried the program at other locations as well. I hope she'd do it outside my apartment. So let me just say a few words about Lara. Lara is a student of Bina's who graduated this year with a bachelor degree in civil engineering. Lara has experience as an intern civil engineer at various companies in Indonesia. And she is waiting for the official graduation from Bina's that she's hoping to get in November. And then she has the task of looking for a job or a husband. Okay, Lara, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Mr. David. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your time and attention. My name is Annisya, but for short, you can call me Lara. And today I'm going to present my thesis. Is about analysis of pedestrian facilities level of service based on the class in railway station. Which is the case study was in Manggar Station, Citayam Station, and Cawang Station, and guided by my lecturer, Mr. Edward. So the first is introduction, why I chose this topic. First, it's because Jakarta is the main economic city, which is many of the company in Jakarta. So many people are coming from another area going to Jakarta and mostly crowded in Jakarta Bogor line. So I do the research in Jakarta Bogor line after I do observation. And quoted by databooks.com, it was #1 highest density, which is half 5-minute headway, and then have 387 trips every day. And I also experienced myself this condition in this situation, which is, I think, it is safe, it is comfort for us as a pedestrian or passenger to ride a train. And that's why I want to evaluate the pedestrian facilities level of service for this condition. And as I know from the ministerial regulation, there are 3 classified classes for the station, which is the large class, middle class, and also small class station. So for the theoretical study, first I have to find the pedestrian characteristics so I can find the level of service. First, I have to know the pedestrian flow each station, pedestrian speed, pedestrian density, and the relation between the 3, and also the pedestrian space needed as a reference to find the level of service. So as you can see in the presentation, there is a minimal standard for pedestrians have a space at each other. So it has 0.6 shoulder breadth and 0.45 meter shoulder breadth. It was for us as a pedestrian to know the sensory zone. The sensory zone is a pedestrian to know the walking state. And next is the station class. As I speak over here, there are 3 classes in Indonesia based on railway company in Indonesia. There are large class station, mid class station, and small class station. And for the last class station, there are up to more than 5 lines and have a locomotive depot and have train storage depot. And for the mid class, 4 to 5 lines and only have train storage depot. And for the small class, it only has 2 up to 3 lines. And for the level of service, this is the reference for, I know the level of service for the tap gate area. So I research in my scope is in platform area and tap gate area. And for the platform area, I'm using this highway capacity manual as a standard in pedestrian pathways. And for the tap gate area is using the level of service pedestrian when queuing. And there is a minimum standard for platform width from the ministry regulation for train station building technical requirements. Yeah, this is the standard that I'm using. And sorry. So this is like I'm using this PTP swap, which is the software that I'm using to simulate my research. PTP swap is mostly what used from Germany, and it can simulate in 2D and 3D. So for the data collections, I collect data for station diagrammatic design, so I can modeling in the BTV vessel, and I also get the pedestrian target passenger in 2023 and 10 years later, which is in 2033. And for the pedestrian traffic data, I collect data for the pedestrian volume and pedestrian density. And this is the tools that I'm using while I observation. And this is the location and type for while I observe. And this is the result for all the station condition for the volume. As you can see, the station Chitaya has the highest volume. And the more filled, the more congested the station. And as you can see, the density is also station Chitaya, so Chitaya station and Chitaya Chawang station, sorry, that have highest density in the morning and in the evening, which is when people going to work and when they go back to after their work. And this is the pedestrian space monolith. So the pedestrian space monolith is the space between each pedestrians, and if it is more than 0.30, which is the standard, it is good. But the fact that the reality that the space monolith is less than 1.30, it is very congested for the station and town station. And for the pedestrian flow, as you can see in the slide, the highest flow is in Jatam station and the town station. And this is the simulation that I make in BT50 log. So I want to know the condition this year, and then 10 years later, if the design is in existing. So I observe what if I analyze the volume of the pedestrian in 10 years with the existing model, and it came out as pretty congested in 10 years. So next is the level of service. So in here, as we can see in the slide, this year for the Manggar station, still in loss A, which is still good. But in Chitayam station and Cawang station, the loss is in loss M for the Chitayam station near the Debiat area, which is very, very crowded, like real life. And this is the 10 years later after I simulate with the volume prediction in 10 years, which is all the platform area are in loss. So for the platform minimum with level of service, we can see that the Manggar station and the Chao station still adequate, and for the Chitayam station not adequate. This is very interesting because Chitayam station is mid-class, but the platform width less than the small class. So this is going to be a critics for the railway company in Bina. And the conclusion is the level of service for pedestrian facilities in Chao station and Chitayam station for the Debiat area is not sufficient or not adequate, and the Manggar station is still adequate in all areas, which is there is still a blue or loss A, and the level of minimum platform size is also very, very far from the standard, so it's still adequate. So in order to have an adequate and effective pedestrian facility at Cawang station, Chitayam station, I recommend a multi-level development that also has been done in Pondok Cina station. And for the Manggar station, because it is a large station, so I could recommend to increase the number of tap gates and increase the turning trips. I think that's all for me. Thank you so much.
Well, I have to say that was very impressive, particularly
Okay.
well, I have to say that was very impressive, particularly the graphics. And thank you very much. And I apologize for thinking it was about crossing the road. In fact, it's about the train stations. And I can see that it's, in 10 years' time, if a platform gets overcrowded, it's a very dangerous situation. Would anyone like to ask a question from the back of the hall? Do we have any questions from the internet? No? Okay, in that case, if there's no questions, I'll ask one. When you showed one of the stations was rather dangerous, what do you think they should be doing about it to make it safe? Should they be widening the platform? Should they be, I've just been on the Queen Elizabeth line in London, and where there are gates, you have to, the train has to line up with gates, so that there's no way anyone can get on the platform. So can you just answer that question? And what do you think they should do to make it safe?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, can you stand in front?
Okay, thank you for the question. As I said earlier, I think for the Chawang station and Chitang station, it has to be a multi-development. I think they have to like build a second floor like Manggarai station and Pondok Cina station, because the location was in the center of the in the city, so most of the side was like road. So for the platform to be more bigger is, I think it's so not recommended. So I think multi-level is the best recommendation, like in Pondok Cina station. And for the Manggarai, it was still good and still adequate for the platform. So I think the train trips can be more, and also the decades, like I said.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce Chris Morris. I've known Chris for about 35 years, which to the students must sound like an incredibly long time, and we must be incredibly old, and we probably are. Chris joined the same company as I did after completing his MSc at Southampton, where I also graduated in irrigation engineering. He came out to Aceh first, to Banda Aceh, where we were working on a British aid project called the Design Unit to train the provincial engineers in water resources and irrigation. Now, the thing about, at the time, we shared a job to give him and myself more experience. We were both planning and design engineers, but also operation and maintenance engineers. So we had a much broader interest in what was going on in the province. We covered the whole province, so we travelled around the province, which was very beautiful. At the time, Aceh was considered a hardship post, so we didn't tell head office that we probably had the best beach in the world. We had a sports club where we could drink beer and play tennis and play squash. We could go on a hash, which always finished at a beer truck in incredible countryside. The other thing that perhaps Chris learned from me, probably from my first input in Bandung, was to use the indigenous natural resources to build a family. In other words, to find a wife. So Chris found a wife in Aceh. He also joined with some friends to own a prawn farm, and he built a house nearby. Unfortunately, when the tsunami came, the prawn farms got wiped out. So his business experience was for naught. But the house remained while all around perished, partly because Chris had spent a lot of time supervising the contractors in the steel work within the concrete. It had a concrete frame and it survived. The only other house that also survived was that belonging to our economist, who'd borrowed Chris's design and borrowed his workers to build his house later. And that survived as well, which was just as well, because across the road was an orphanage. And when the tsunami came, one of the teachers or two of the teachers took something like 23 children across the road onto the second floor, and they survived. So you can't see the little halo he has, but he perhaps deserves one. Since Aceh, Chris and I have worked on quite a few projects together over the next 20 or so years, both in Java and other places. The one that's I have greatest memory of is repairing something like 94 irrigation schemes down the coast of Aceh and Nias. And Chris and I worked on the design of that project, and later he supervised the consultants, including me, that did the design and supervision of construction. So I don't want to go into any more detail on Chris's work and his career, because I think that's what he's going to talk about. But I'd just like to leave you with one memory that sticks in my mind, was that the Aceh Design Unit were given 3 Land Rovers and a rubber raft with a wooden frame in it. We couldn't find a use for it until I found that the Pusangan River went very close to the road up to Taquignon in 2 places. So we decided we'd go rafting. Unfortunately, Pusangan River drops about 1,000 meters in about 60 meters, and there are some pretty big rapids. When we got there, we found out that the river was actually about 200 meters lower down. So we carried the heavy raft and the frame between us. And when we got to the bottom and saw the river, we saw these huge rapids, but no one wanted to carry the boat back up. So we persevered, and the first 2 rapids filled the boat with water and we bailed out. The next one was a kind of chute, and we went sideways down it. And at the end of a chute is what's called a hydraulic jump, but canoeists call it a stopper. And it stopped the boat, and it stopped Chris, and it stopped me. But our 3 other passengers went straight out the side and floated downstream, leaving Chris and I in the boat. And we tried to force the boat off the chute, but it kept vibrating, well, oscillating between the chute and the stopper, going up and down, up and down. Eventually, I lost my footing and went over the side, leaving Chris valiantly trying to secure the boat from this huge rapid, while we all looked on and hoped. And I don't know, at some point he must have got some supernatural strength and managed to push the boat off and came through the rapid. So I have Chris to thank for that. Anyway, I'd like to just hand over to Chris to talk about his career rather than his adventures.
Thank you, David. I got a mic, and but perhaps we should have left David up. His story seemed a lot funnier than mine. The boat is still full of water. Yes. It's been
Small camera. Oh, you can stand here.
and some here. You can put me on and off. Okay. So, yeah, 35 years. I heard screeches come out when you mentioned that.
Do you want to try this one first? I think it's a bit better.
Hello, is this better? Yes. At the back? Yeah, okay, 35 years. I heard screeches from part of the participants, and as that came out, it actually takes me back 25 years ago. I was chair of the ICE here and helping organize these sessions. So it is, I am very pleased to be invited back. It was David who did it, so he's to blame if things don't continue following his very pleasant introduction. I am a civil engineer by background. I'm water engineer, and I've spent much of my career here in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. Just to share a little bit about me, which sets the scene for my career, which is a little bit different to many civil engineers and where I ended up. I was born in the UK, so I'm British, and it's there which is the heart of civil engineering. And if you go to the ICE website, one sees the definition of civil engineering is that the civil engineering profession is one that I'm just checking I get the words right because it is from the website. Civil engineers shape the world that we live in. So I'm very pleased to be here today amongst ICE colleagues, but also the younger generation of engineers here from Indonesia and those joining online. As well as being an engineer, I'm very passionate about and very comfortable with disruption and change. And I use throughout my career visionary planning processes. I claim to be a futuristic thinker. I'm very comfortable with design thinking and many of the ways that young people today approach life and their thinking processes. I'm also a strong believer in civic engagement, which is something that not all civil engineers meet. It depends on the discipline that you get involved in. And being a water engineer, I would put it to you that it's part of the profession of civil engineers that possibly does more civic engagement or meets citizens more directly than some of the other branches of civil engineering. A fourth characteristic of myself is, and David mentioned the family, I am a family man. I did get married up in Aceh. I have 3 kids. They're now all in the UK, and they're young professionals in their late 20s. But I'd like to also, as I'm sharing a bit of my journey with you, which will come on to working with the work that I've done in civic engagement and particularly with young people, I'd like to know a little bit about the people who are here in the room with you today. I do apologize for, I don't know how many we have online at the moment. If I'd have thought in advance that there'd be people online as well, we could have done this with a piece of IT and asked some questions as well. Earlier in this week, when I thought about some of the things that I might delve into and look at, one of the things I decided to do was to have a look at ChatGPT and use it as a tool in my presentation. So the first question I have to the audience, and this is not young people and the adults here, is how many people use ChatGPT or a similar AI tool? No. Okay, that's about 50%. How many people actually know what the GPT means? Nobody, okay. It's actually generative pre-trained transformer, which is what it stands for as an acronym. What it actually means is far too complex to go in today, but as an AI tool, it's a fantastic thing to get to have a look at. And it is something which I think will, and I'll come back to this a little bit later in the presentation, shape the way a lot of us work. And as young people and as civil engineers, using technology is something that is valuable throughout our profession and our life. So second question, who's 22 years of age or younger? That's nobody. 25 or under?
At the back there, they all are. They're just shy.
Anyone 25 or under? 30 or under? 30 or under. Yep. Most of the young people here. I think that that's also important in terms of the civic work I've got, because it is important to look at your audience and participants, and civil engineers are when they're working with citizens, then have to have a clear picture of who their constituents are. So how many people were born in Java here? Born in Java. No. Yes, 1, 2, 20%. And how many were born in cities? Okay, now that's an interesting one. The majority of people.
City in Java.
Cities in Java. I won't go into so much detail. Okay, I'll come back to myself, and we'll visit some of those characteristics of the people in the room later in the presentation. So I'm actually very fortunate. I started my engineering career, according to my parents, when I was a very young kid, about 3 years old, digging canals and building bridges on beaches. I've always known I wanted to be a civil engineer. I come from Leicester, which is in the centre of the UK. City that not many people have heard about until a tycoon bought Leicester City Football Club, and they in 2010, and they went on and won the league 5 years later. But it is close to Telford, about an hour's drive away. And Telford's a city which is at the heart of the first industrial revolution in the UK. And it was named Telford sometime later in the 1960s, after Thomas Telford, who was the first president of the Institute of Civil Engineers around about 1810. At that time, civil engineering was described as the art of directing the great sources of nature for the use and the convenience of mankind. I remember the quote as a young engineer when I was taking my professional exam, because this was one of the things that quite frequently came up. It's interesting that the ICE has changed its definition of website slightly now, although it does still very much recognise the importance of civil engineers to society. So I graduated at high school in Leicester. I studied maths and engineering, and then went on and did a Bachelor of Civil Engineering at Birmingham University, where I joined the company that David was working with at the time, consulting firm in London. Immediately after, I did a master's in, which David mentioned, in irrigation. And I specialised throughout my career in irrigation or in water resources. The first few years of my career, I was working from London. I was very fortunate to be within the hydraulics department of this global water firm, working with some brilliant scientists and mathematical programmers. To reflect on my age, although I could do coding, and I was doing it back in the early 80s, we were doing coding in Fortran. We were punching it into cards and then taking those cards and feeding them into a computer. And it used to actually take sometimes 12 hours overnight. We'd run these programs to get results of mathematical simulations, which which can now be done on laptops and even on your phone. My career developed quite rapidly after that. I worked on a couple of irrigation projects overseas. I spent 18 months in Mauritania and 6 months in the bottom of the Dead Sea in Jordan, both irrigation, different purposes. Mauritania, it was very much about feeding the locals and poverty reduction. In Jordan, we were growing or the client was growing strawberries and flowers for the European market. And it was at that time that, or shortly after then, in 1986, that I first came out to Indonesia and met David and the actually design unit, which he mentioned earlier, which was I was a 28-year-old engineer, and I was very fortunate to be brought out under a British aid-funded project and join the provincial water resources strengthening project up in Aceh. I worked there for about five years. A planning project, UK funded, turned into an implementation project. And one of the most interesting and I think valuable experiences I've had during my career was being on that project at a provincial level for a 5 or 6 year term, because I was involved in the whole project cycle from the planning, design and construction, and also in the operation and maintenance and institutional strengthening of the farmers and farmer groups that were involved in the utilization of those systems. And as an engineer, or I think as a professional, in any career, if you actually see something through from the beginning right through to the end, you do learn a lot. It's certainly very satisfactory, but it was also a learning experience, because you do see what adjustments are required as you go along. And it was during that time, a lot of the schemes up in Aceh that we were working on are small, 50, 500, 1,000 hectares. It doesn't have the large schemes predominantly as you have in Java here. So the schemes involved a lot of water user associations and institutional work, looking at the relationships between those water user associations and the government. And I found that very, very rewarding and very, very interesting. I then spent a time in Pakistan working on a big civil engineering project from the Tarbela Reservoir, which is the most upstream dam on the River Indus. It's one of those mega projects, which was also a fascinating experience as an engineer. I was responsible for design of a section of about 5,000 hectares of irrigation from that scheme. The Tarbela Reservoir is, at the time, it was the largest rock-filled dam in the world. It still is one of the largest. It serves about 20% of Pakistan's energy, 3.5 gigawatts, and controls and manages over 3.5 million hectares of irrigation downstream. So also a fascinating project. I was doing technical work, and I found that very rewarding and interesting. I then came back to Indonesia. I worked on a number of projects, some in the private sector, here in Jakarta with Thames Water, who was a concession holder. I worked with the Bakri Group in water supply in Bali, irrigation schemes and water resources in NTT. And I became the country director of the consulting firm that I was still with until about 2015, when I left my consulting career and moved to join the Asian Development Bank. I was certainly very satisfied with what I'd done in that first stage of my career, which happened to be about 25 years. So if you're a young person here today and at that sort of age, it is a long period. But I'd traveled extensively. I'd worked on a whole range of schemes, which I found very satisfying. I've seen projects through to completion. And I got very interested in working with communities and civil society on projects which, as a civil engineer, have certainly shaped their lives, as that's what the profession is about. Why did I leave? It was partly professional. I felt that it was time to move on from providing services as a consultant, to be more involved in the overall planning and financing of projects. It was partly institutional. My direct boss had just been fired 6 months before, and I'd been very much part of the organization design and felt that my time, the consulting firm that I was with was not going in the direction that I wanted to. And again, back to the family values. My children were early teenagers. I was traveling a lot and we wanted to be together. So a mix of reasons to move on after a satisfying initial career as a consultant water resource engineer. I joined the ADB, as I said, 2005. It was just after the tsunami, which is of course December 2004. I did get involved, as David was, in some of the reconstruction activities, and I managed a $30 million grant from the ADB, or the component of a larger grant of about $300 million. I managed the $30 million irrigation and agricultural component that was very satisfying. I was working and in charge of water resources and irrigation projects in the Philippines and Indonesia, working with government agencies, ministries of finance, planning and designing the schemes and taking them through to some partnership financial instruments, loans or grants with governments in the Philippines and Indonesia. There are many, or a number of interesting projects I could take you through. I think the most interesting to me was, from the water resources point of view, was working with public works here in Indonesia on an integrated water resource management planning or long-term planning project to develop the water services from what is the most strategic river in Java, the Citarum River Basin, which starts up in the mountains around Bandung, and it flows through three dams onto the North Java floodplain and irrigates large irrigation areas, and also feeds at that time about 8% of Jakarta's water. And we put together a multi-tranche financing facility with the ADB for over $4 billion, of which the first of which ADB was financing about $500 million. That particular project was approved in 2008. I wasn't involved in the implementation of it, as I got promoted out of water resources, then had a real career change and became the head of ADB's NGO and Civil Society Centre. Now that wasn't a change within my discipline, but a lot of the work and training that I'd had as a young civil engineer or working with governments, working with institutions, put me, I would argue, in very good position to be able to work with the NGO and Civil Society Centre, or head that unit within ADB. It was an interesting career move because it took me from my Southeast Asia focus to work across the whole of Asia and the Pacific. I got to work in Pacific islands like Timor-Leste, Fiji, Samoa. I worked up in Central Asia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and also was involved in some quite interesting high-level managerial features of the decision making within ADB in terms of how it worked with civil society. ADB as a multilateral development bank, and there's the largest globally is the World Bank, but there are regional multilateral development banks and some sector or thematic multilateral development banks as well. But the ADB covered Asia from Georgia across to the Pacific Islands, the portfolio of about $30 billion a year. It had its own NGO watchdogs that ensured that the projects were designed and implemented in a sustainable manner using good environmental and social practices. I, heading the NGO and Civil Society Centre, then I had the interesting task of I suppose the most interesting task. It certainly wasn't the most pleasant task, but when I remember looking back on quite fondly was once a year at ADB's annual meeting with its stakeholders. There was a 1 hour question and answer time that I moderated with the ADB president and about 200 advocacy NGOs. So it wasn't a position I thought I would be in when I was a younger engineer. But it's interesting how careers unfold and lead you into particular roles. Specific projects I also got involved in at that time. Some projects that were very controversial with civil society groups for various reasons, often to do with either the environment, there's a band of NGOs that are anti-dams, for example, or helping the rights of citizens who are disturbed by projects. And I found that fascinating and very, very rewarding. But one of the projects, which is some examples of some of the challenging projects, in Uzbekistan, for example, ADB, in hindsight, was probably regretted it in the end, signed a loan to lend money which upgraded some large irrigation canals to feed a couple of cities in the center of Uzbekistan with water. These canals also fed large cotton fields which had been developed during the Soviet era. And at that time, there was child labor used for cotton picking. Uzbekistan 10 years ago used to close down schools and send the children and the teachers out to the cotton fields during harvest. This was certainly against all good standards of human rights and failed to be in compliance with good practice project implementation and ADB's own compliance system and was a target of the NGOs. The Chicharan project itself here in Indonesia was one that also went to compliance because of resettlement issues, differences of opinion between how to implement the resettlement plan of the project, and NGOs were very much involved in that. So it did lead to my role as head of the NGO Civil Society Centre did lead to some project work which was closely related, or because I'd worked at a field level as a young civil engineer, I did have a lot of relevant experience for that. But the greatest achievement I felt during the last 10 years with ADB, and I retired last June in 2022, was I started an initiative in 2013, which is called the Youth for Asia Initiative. And it was an initiative to bring young people into the planning and design of ADB's projects. This program is still running. You can see it on the website. If you're interested, please have a look at Youth for Asia. It's not a professional development program for young people, but it is a program that brings the attributes of young people in intergenerational teams, working to help make the projects more sustainable, better design, more community aspects, using the attributes that young people have. And I spend a lot of time with NGOs and specialists working with young people to develop the tools to bring young people into design projects. And I think that is something that as young engineers, then it's important, obviously, for a profession like civil engineering to develop the technical skills, but the soft skills as well of young people are also extremely valuable in the project cycle. We did research to demonstrate that young people, typically up to the age of about 30, are actually more resilient and resourceful, and they're more caring citizens than adults are. They're natural collaborators. Their behavior insights of community issues are significant. They're disruptive thinkers and digitally literate. Now, some of those characteristics are obvious. Other ones are less obvious. But those attributes coming into design teams, working across generations, is something that I'm a strong advocate for because I've seen it very effectively. I'm just wondering where we are on time, David.
Continue near the end.
A couple of examples I have of Youth for Asia working on projects. Chip to Carrier, the Human Settlements Division of Public Works, were planning a city development project in Cirebon, and we mobilized a couple of young people to organize focus group discussions and mobilize young marginalized youth within Cirebon to look at their aspirations and development requirements within the city. Now, one of the reasons I asked whether people were, okay, your age earlier, but whether you were city or not, a lot of cities within Indonesia and certainly across Asia Pacific are very youthful. Over 50% of the global youth live in Asia at the moment. Some countries have demographics under the age of 30 in the 60s and 70%. You find many cities, the GERs, the slum areas around Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, for example, those slum areas, because migrants tend to be young, are 70–75% young people. A lot of the cities here in Indonesia also have a significant youth population. So the value of working with young people in your planning and design teams gives you access to those youth. One of the things that came out of the work with the Youth for Asia initiative was the design of a meaningful youth engagement framework for and how to measure the readiness of an organization to work inclusively with young people. It covers things like safe space, inclusive work, intergenerational participation, the resources required by young people to work effectively with projects, and what are good youth engagement practices. And that framework has led to more effective and inclusive organizations, in many cases, who are able to work with young people. So I'm sort of optimistic that particularly the skills of civil engineers and those youthful skills of civil engineers are naturally suited for the civil engineering profession of working to shape the world that we live in. Going back to ChatGPT, it says that civil engineers, and I'm reading this because it is a quote, must have high ethical standards, professionalism in the work, prioritize safety of people, create people-focused, sustainable solutions, have strong communication and collaboration skills, and should embrace innovation and continuing learning. I think those are skills that a lot of young people have. They're attributes of young people, which stands you in good stead. So I'll perhaps come to a conclusion of some of the things I've learned in my career, or the journey that I've been, with a few messages related to real challenges for the young people in the room and those online as the region develops. There are challenges in sustainable solutions. There's the ADB estimates infrastructure requirements of Asia and Pacific are in the trillions of dollars a year. I think it's about 1.3, 1.4 at the moment. Civil engineers are part of that development. Steel and concrete are a major factor in what we work with as civil engineers. And the steel and the concrete that goes into projects is responsible for about 14 to 16% of the global CO2 footprint at the moment, compared to 12, 15% from vehicles. So how is the profession going to continue with the infrastructure in a sustainable way will be important moving forward. The demographics of Asia Pacific is changing, and the migration into cities, both from the individual country point of view within the countries. There's a number of countries, and this is important again for the young people. It's not so much a problem here in Indonesia, but a number of young countries, and the growing number, have populations which are projected to peak very soon, if not already, and start declining. Korea and Japan are probably the most demographically challenged. where they have a population replacement rate which is significantly lower than what is required. China's population is decreasing, Thailand is close to us as well. And this will mean that the engineering requirements reduce, but also the position of the number of young people or adults working compared to older people will influence the change in the region. Technology, as I say, will be important. And I mentioned Telford, where the first industrial revolution started. I think that will be a key thing, if not the most fundamental thing, that the young people will see change in the profession and how societies live moving forward. What I find fascinating is that the first industrial revolution to the second, that is, the first was where we went from man-made to machine-made, to the second where we went from the machines to mobility and factory-made, and then the third, the computerization came in. Those time gaps between the first and the second industrial revolution went from over 100 years to about 50 to 60 years. The fourth, which we're going through at the moment, looking at AI and the way that we do things, came even quicker. And as we move through to the fifth industrial revolution, which is the convergence of the physical and the digital technologies, then the projections are that the sixth industrial revolution, which will certainly happen in your lifetimes, will be focused on addressing some of the key challenges, such as sustainability, climate change, resource scarcity, social inequality. That's what the sixth industrial revolution is supposed to be all about. It seeks to create new systems and technologies to promote a more sustainable and inclusive society. And I hope for the survival of the planet and the people that it achieves what it promises. As a young engineer, I was unable to sort of predict where my journey would take you. I think your careers are going to be plagued with a lot more disruption and challenges because of some of the issues I've mentioned today. But as civil engineers, I think the training you have and the professionals around you and the systems that you work to put you in good stead to continue careers. And I hope they're as successful and as enjoyable as mine, and that you also feel that you've contributed as a civil engineer to shape some of that world that we all live in. So with that, I'll end there. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank Chris for his interesting talk. I hope that there's some lessons for the young people here and the young people online. One lesson I took from Chris's talk was that he had 20 years of working at the coalface or the front line, getting experience, not only about civil engineering, but also about life, about people, about communities, before he went into ADB and started managing projects at a much higher level. And then his interest took him into what's happening to young people. And young people are going to inherit the earth. And I just wonder what state it's going to be when they take it over and then hand it on to the next generation. Climate change is something that worries me, something that I've been involved in. I think we can ask Chris some questions. Does anyone in the room have a question first? Can you?
Most challenging. Yeah. Certainly most challenging was the integrated Chittering Water Resource Management Project, which took over 3 years in its planning and design and until the first stage of it was approved. Water resources or river basin planning is challenging in itself. You have to protect the water resources. That's the environment, the forest, and the way farmers and community use and pollute the rivers. And then you have to also think about the services, which may be from a big river like the Chittering, 3 dams, hydropower, irrigation, industrial use, and Jakarta city water supply. So a very, very complex planning project. Attached to that, there was the first tranche of this multi-tranche investment program. There was attached to it a $10 million grant from the Dutch government on the planning side alone, just to put in place a decision support systems to get the planning right. And there was controversy politically. NGOs believe that the private sector shouldn't be involved in the water resources. They were the political hierarchy of decentralization within Indonesia was complex. Jakarta did pay, and I still don't think they pay for the water supply, which comes from West Java. The 13 kabupaten within the river basin, all with different levels of responsibility. So highly complex, controversial, something you're never going to get right. But what was really valuable was to actually we put together, as part of that planning process, working with civil society, a citizen and government partnership in terms of what were their aspirations for the river basin, which, if I recall correctly, was citizens and government working together for a clean, productive, healthy river. Now, the clean and healthy is something which we aspire to all rivers. What came from the citizens as well was the realizations that water is a productive asset for the country. So probably my most challenging project, that was.
Are there any more projects? Mike?
Yeah. I'll leave your microphone. Chris, that's very, very deep, interesting talk then. You mentioned an important number just now, which was the spending, I think, in Asia on infrastructure per year of $1.3 trillion. Mm-hmm. Is Asia producing enough young engineers to actually manage and create and do all the design work and construction work for that huge development? I mean, ADB must have looked into a thing like that, I'd have thought, to see if the resources are being developed to meet those targets, because it's important, I think, to the young engineers here.
And as young engineers, are you having difficulty finding a job, or are you overworked? not that they're directly connected. There are ADB doesn't directly itself, but there are organizations that look very carefully at sectors and employment in them. The UN family member, the International Labour Organization, has a breakdown of sectors, and there's about 35 standard sectors which it looks at employment across, and then they correlate work with the Ministry of Education to predict future demands. I did some work with them during the pandemic with some economic modeling from ADB, looking at these sectors and then predicting the downturn in the sectors because of the pandemic and the loss of jobs across the sectors. We actually found, interestingly, for young people, that the sectors most disproportionately negative affected by the pandemic were the sectors that employed the most young people. And one of the sectors, I'm fairly sure, is on the construction side. So that data would be available. One of the things that isn't available, and I've here in Asia Pacific, and it's a cultural thing, is that there is no youth work education sector. There are no universities, there are no colleges. In most countries, there are exceptions that produce youth workers. And it's a sector that is left to fend for themselves. There are elderly care sector institutions that produce elderly care workers, recognizing that older people are a sector that need specific care, but there isn't a care sector for young people. After education, and youth is described as a transition between childhood and adulthood, but after education, you're on your own in most countries, rather than having a specific sector support, which you find in many developed countries for young people in terms of where to go for employment. Or, you know, I wasn't taught at school how to open a bank account or apply for a passport or to save for my pension. There's a lot of life skills which you only learn as you transition into being an adult. And there's very few government services that provide those. There's more coming available, for example, in online over the last 5 years or so. But it is a sector that is under supported.
Okay, any more questions? Perhaps I can ask one. Chris has demonstrated that it's been very valuable for him to have had 20 years experience as a civil engineer before he joined the ADB, where you are more of a manager of money and supervisor of projects. Now, I know most people working for ADB are either from countries that provide money to the ADB or countries that receive money from the ADB. So there are quite a few Indonesians working for the ADB, both in Jakarta and in Manila, and also in other countries. I just want to ask Chris to make some comments about career paths for Indonesian engineers. And I know the ADB doesn't just do water projects, it does transport, it does municipal projects, it does a whole range of different infrastructure projects. as well as having a whole range of other specialists such as environmentalists and sociologists and legal specialists. So I just asked Chris to make a comment or two about a career path for Indonesians.
So for young civil engineers wanting to gain experience across a range of project cycle, I would not recommend ADB as an employer early on in your career. I think you'd miss out on a lot of hands-on experience that would be required later on in your life. As an engineer, there are opportunities in ADB in particular sectors for consultants, including young consultants. There is an intern program within ADB also. If you're interested in short-term research assignments in particular fields, and Lara, the research that you did might be very relevant and interesting. It's a lot of the work that ADB does, because it's a bank, is linked to economic and financial research. So it tends to be, and there is an ADB Institute based in Japan, but it produces academic information related to finance and economics. There's also opportunities for young people in terms of education. There is a large grant system in the ADB for Indonesians wanting to do a master's within the region, which may be of interest to qualified engineers wanting to branch out or further your education with a master's. Again, that can be found on the website, but if you have trouble finding it, then you can always contact me through the ICE and I'll locate that for you.
Well, I was just going to say we don't have any questions from the Zoom or the internet. Is there any more questions? If not, I can see the food getting put out, so perhaps we're getting hungry. So I'd just like to thank Chris for his talk, and perhaps we can show our appreciation again. So thank you for a very interesting talk, Chris. Okay, so we can have the food. Oh, sorry.
Okay, everyone. First of all, thank you, David May, for guiding the session. Once again, thank you for all the speakers for your excellent presentation. For Venusian students that want to claim their SAT point and get their e-certificate, you can fill out the exit form. You can scan using the barcode. And okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have now reached the end of the event. Once again, thank you for your participation. We hope to see you at the next event. At last, good evening and stay healthy, everyone.